Hey everyone, welcome back to the Law of Code podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Robinson, and today my guest is Justin Wales. Justin is head of legal for the Americas for Crypto.com, and he also recently published the second edition of his book, the Crypto Legal Handbook, which you can see behind me. And we're going to talk in detail about his book, what's in the second edition, as well as his thoughts around crypto, how the regulations have evolved, how they may continue to evolve in the future with market structure and stablecoin legislation on the table, as well as artificial intelligence and the role crypto will play in that domain. Now, before we get into the episode, a quick word of thanks to our sponsor. This episode of the Law of Code podcast is brought to you by Day One Law, a boutique corporate law firm founded by recurring guest and friend of the show, Nick Pullman. Nick and his team at Day One Law provide strategic legal counsel to startups, crypto projects, and Web3 innovators. You can get in contact with them via the top link in the show notes below. Justin, congratulations. The book is out. We'll put a link in the show notes for anyone who's interested in purchasing a copy. There's been a lot of changes. Obviously, it's a huge paradigm shift in terms of what we're seeing from the regulatory space, in particular with the SEC and just the regulation by enforcement that we were seeing in the Gensler administration compared to this new one with Paul Atkins. So to give a 10,000 foot view before we go deeper into some specific topics, what's been the most important change you've written into this new edition?
It's really the Trump administration has flipped everything on its head. So what I tried to do is capture not only all the changes, but also go back in time and create a resource where it's not just war stories and it's not just the 2024 edition with a paragraph at the end saying everything you just read doesn't matter anymore. And really try to think, if I had to write this over again, what do we need to know about the history, right? I think a lot of the enforcement actions that even have been dropped are still important to know about because those legal theories are still in the air. I think a future federal administration could go and push those forward again. You were seeing states like Oregon pushing them forward. We're seeing private plaintiffs' actions pushing them forward. But it's really trying to get a sense of like, what is the minimum history that someone needs to know to understand the context for where we are today? And also, where are we today? So there's a lot of updates for the SEC chapter, obviously. There were a lot of updates in state level regulations. So we went through and updated all the states. We added sections on like meme coins, which there was not a meme coins were around, but they weren't as sort of popular as they are now. We added a section on AI. I say we to make it sound more important. It was me, and then a friend Spencer helped me with some of the research. And then every chapter had edits and revisions because we didn't want it to look like it was just a lazy update. I mean, in some ways, this was almost as difficult as writing it new because you really had to think, well, oh, I remember struggling over this section a year and a half ago. Do I really need to delete it? Right? You started to have to kill your darling and say, well, what is the best way to make this the most impactful read that you can?
A lot of the discourse has been around what we've seen from securities regulators, particularly in the US. But there's, as you mentioned, there's also a lot of things changing at the state level. We've seen the Oregon Attorney General bring the lawsuit against Coinbase. But has there been other aspects of state level, either money transmission rules or other areas where people might not be as aware of these changes that stood out to you while you were writing this revised version?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one was obviously the Oregon action, also updates in how the states are regulating money transmission. So you had more states join the Money Transmission Modernization Act. You had some confusion in the states where you have a few states that have said, we don't regulate this area of digital assets, but in practice, anyone who actually interacts with that state says, well, actually they do. So it's really trying to give like a practical guide to how some of these states operate, and really the takeaway should be that it's quite confusing, right? Because you have states that have written guidance that sometimes doesn't match their practical scope of their what they see as their jurisdiction. You have a lot of legislatures trying to create new rules that are in various stages. So like California, for example, is going to have the equivalent of a bit license fairly soon. Illinois looks like it's going to pass theirs. You have New York and Louisiana, which have their own bit license. And there's a couple other states that are in the background thinking about that. And the question always is, well, how does that compare to like the proposed federal regulations, which would be like a market structure. So we try to explore a little bit of that in the book, but again, in a way that gives someone who's reading this without any background in history or law or crypto or technology the tools needed to like really understand how this industry got to where it is and not bog them down in just the minutia of, regulatory politics and things like that.
And the history is so important too, because then you understand why the rules got tabled and where they came from and what they were born out of, what the ultimate goal was. And so there's a few changes that we've spoken about already in terms of what's happened in the US over the past 12 months since the first edition was published. There's a new administration in. They're taking a much different approach across the board when it comes to regulating crypto. We're seeing rules begin to get tabled, legislation be proposed. Stablecoin seems to be moving through the House and the Senate. Market structure, the industry is hoping will take a similar path forward. What do you see the timelines being for those bills? Do you think by the time edition number 3 is published next year, we'll have stablecoin legislation and market structure, or are we probably more likely to only see one, if any?
I think it's pretty likely we'll get a stablecoin bill sooner rather than later. That seems to have like some real bipartisan momentum. The market structure is much more difficult. It's a harder challenge to solve. It requires you to really think about what is the role of the CFTC and the SEC and the states. And I don't know if all of those questions have really been grappled with by, the different stakeholders. And I also think that the politics of crypto are getting more difficult, right? So it's becoming more and more partisan. So even if you had like some agreement or some consensus, I think just politics, it's hard to get, Congress to agree that puppies are cute, right? Like, let alone market structure legislation. So I'm hopeful that like people will be able to get things done and put aside their, differences and partisan sort of instincts. But it wouldn't surprise me if in the 2026 edition, we still did not have permanent clarity.
Yeah, and it seems like we do
One,
have a finite window of time, at least as long as this administration is in power, because the pendulum could always swing. And that's one thing you mentioned earlier, too, is just how things change so quickly and so drastically when you have projects that are in the US looking for some sort of path and trying to make decisions where there are statute of limitations that could come into play depending on what they're doing. But now also rules could completely change. You could be negotiating with the government over market structure and that could disappear. And so I think it's difficult for projects where there's so much uncertainty over what the future might hold. In terms of lawyers who are reading this second edition, who might have purchased the first, read through parts of it, maybe read through all of it, or how would you recommend they approach this new edition?
the book is kind of like divided into two sections, right? The first, I would say, 9 chapters are the story of crypto, right? Information about the technology, information about like where we are, but there hasn't been a lot in like the updating of like the infrastructure of Bitcoin, right? So you probably don't need to go through with the underlying like chapter 4, right? The Bitcoin like infrastructure chapter. But from chapter, I think it's 9 on, it's all about federal and state regulation, and that's where the majority of like the substantive changes are. So for example, if you wanted to go and say, well, what has happened in the last year and how do I put everything that's happened before the last year in context of like where we are now, I would say if you read chapter 9 on, you'll get a pretty good update. Some good examples are when I wrote the first edition, everyone in the industry knew that there was like a banking issue, right? People were getting debanked. I saw it, day to day. It was hard for banks to do any sort of business with crypto, but there wasn't a smoking gun, right? You could just say, oh, okay, maybe there's this Operation Chokepoint 2.0, or maybe there's some federal pressure to get rid of crypto clients, but there wasn't anything there. And what you don't want to do is engage in like speculation in a book that's meant to teach folks who are just starting to get into the space. We have since had quite a lot of information about the debanking of the industry. So I added basically in chapter 10 an entire chapter. I mean, it's still within like, it's just a part 2 of chapter 10. And it goes through Operation Chokepoint 2.0. It goes through all of the resources that back those claims up. It talks a little more about how non-securities, non-commodities, non-BSA regulators enforce federal discrimination against the crypto industry. And it gives you, I think, a better sense of how the federal government's financial regulators work, including the FDIC, the OCC, things like that. We got a lot of helpful notes from tax lawyers who basically said, what you said is correct, but there's a lot more nuance in that could go into the tax section. So I rewrote the tax section so it went from like something like 3 pages, which is like, okay, here's basically how capital gains works. I'm not a tax lawyer, to I think it's like 17 pages now. So now you can read it, you get like a real good sense of how the taxes will apply to crypto transactions, and also the politics behind some of these reporting requirements that has happened in the last year. And then, really interesting updates on the technology. So, like, obviously, like, the meme coins have gotten more popular, but I have a whole section now on AI and like my own theory on where crypto's role in like the broader AI ecosystem is, and where I think that I'd imagine in the next year, a lot of the energy and a lot of the funding will go towards this intersection between crypto and artificial intelligence.
I'm really excited to talk AI with you, and I'm saving that for my last question because I want to get your take on the philosophy of where this could go in the future. But I want to talk to you a bit about tax and meme coins. Is there an example you can give of something that was changed or added or that stood out to you as being notable and maybe the average person might not be aware of?
No, I mean, I think everything was in the original version, but it was just in there in a very like cursory way. So what I've tried to do now is sometimes you take for granted what you already know. And if you have no background in tax, maybe like there were some defined terms or things that I could have done better to flesh it out. So a lot of it was that. I also put a lot of information about like the DeFi broker requirements and reporting requirements, and how that kind of played out politically. That wasn't in the first edition because it hadn't happened yet. But those are the main updates there. For the meme coins, it was sort of interesting because there's an argument to be made that the meme coin section doesn't need to be its own section, because there's nothing inherently different about a meme coin than there is about a crypto. It's become sort of like a buzzwordy other topic in the same way like NFTs are, right? That maybe it requires its own discussion. And essentially what I say in this book is, we talk about the SEC guidance that Commissioner Peirce put out about meme coins and some of the early litigations, right? There's the Hawk Girl litigation, Pump Fund, and things like that. We give that context, but my takeaway really is we as a country have incentivized people to not be ambitious in crypto. I mean, you remember this from like several years ago, but in 2016, 2017, during that first ICO craze, right? There were a lot of people who just said, okay, let me sell a token to sell a token. But there were a lot of really smart people coming out of universities, coming out of research facilities, really technically minded folks who said, how can I use this technology in a way to create something interesting? And what we've done basically through the last like several years of the US administration is said, if you have any ambition to do something with these platforms or with this technology, that's going to result in your business being destroyed and you being persecuted by the government and you being individually held responsible, you being sued to oblivion. So what has happened? Two things have happened in my view that's really sort of sad. One, lots of folks who wanted to get involved in this technology and saw this as like a good thing for the future have left the industry. And these are the technical folks. So where are they now? They're looking at AI. They're looking at like biopharmaceuticals, right? Like they're putting their technical skills into other areas that aren't crypto because they don't want to take on the personal responsibility. And then the folks that do are basically being told by the government that the best way for you to avoid essentially perpetual liability is to make this as useless as possible. So you make it a collector's item, right? You make it the affinity coin, right? That's the way that you make it not a security. And I think that the responsibility of the SEC and I think the responsibility of the government should be to incentivize people to use their skills for their highest and best use. And I do think that the higher and best use of this technology and of people's, ingenuity is to build products that are innovative and that help and do things and are useful. So hopefully we get back to a point soon under this new administration where we're telling folks, here's the way that you can create something really amazing with this like still revolutionary technology. and you're not incentivized to basically take everything out of these projects other than the fact that they can be sold on a market.
And I think a perfect example of what we were seeing under the prior administration at the SEC was the fact that they had never gone after, at least to my knowledge, Unicoin. And then this new administration comes in, they go after this project that isn't really doing anything and committing fraud and allegedly $100 million worth. And that was let go. And you have that, you have a statement on meme coins. There's the roundtables going on. I really commend the administration for what they've done there. And I do think the guidance is what the industry's been yearning for. And I know you've seen that and I've seen that as well.
It's great that they put out the statement on meme coins, but I do think it sends a message that the first statement that they put out is on meme coins, which is basically, I mean, again, like if I'm just a person with a computer science background reading this, it still feels like I'm being told by the federal government that the safest way for you to move forward with a project is to create something that doesn't do anything but exist. And I do think that we need to get to the point pretty quickly where all of these folks who want to get involved in the industry or who are thinking about leaving it or thinking about pursuing other opportunities are told, well, the way that you can create something and use, your technical skills in a way that's useful for society is XYZ.
Well, that's the line they're trying to balance with market structure. It's how do you create a system that's not overly permissive, where you have meme coins or other projects that proliferate and everyone ends up worse in the long run? How do you create a system that sets those boundaries, but still incentivizes projects looking to build actual utility in the space without opening Pandora's box and everything becoming a crypto business in the future? So I think it's a really interesting balancing act. And speaking of balancing acts, I think we're seeing a lot of the legal industry as well as every other industry embracing AI, and blockchain, I think, is no different. And we'll start to see the convergence between the two, in my opinion, over the years. What does that mean for messaging and communication online? I think the impacts we have yet to fully understand. And I watched Mission Impossible last night, so this is a bit fresh in my mind. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but the whole idea is there's an AI being that is out there sending false communications out through social media that leads to chaos. And there's no spoilers here, don't worry. But I do think that there's dangers of that, and blockchain can play a role. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'll put it in context of like my journey in crypto, right? Which is when I first got involved in this space, the thing that was most attractive to me was when I would meet people and the conversations were almost never in the early days about money or the market price or the financial side. It was never really about, well, how are these things going to be regulated? It's how do these technologies impact society? How do they impact our rights? How do they impact the way that I can go and interact with you, right? Because at its core, all blockchain is it's a way for two people to communicate with each other, either financially or otherwise, one-on-one, without having to go through an intermediary. And that is a revolutionary concept, and it's still a revolutionary concept. Those conversations have died out in the last 10 plus years, and now they've become replaced by like overly technical questions about how are these financial products regulated, or just a complete obsession with what is the day-to-day price of this market, right? AI, when I'm talking to my friends with AI, we're talking about what does this do for society? And I think that's like really an exciting thing. And it's causing me and a lot of my friends to spend a lot of time really thinking about, well, okay, this is another revolutionary technology. What does it mean for us and how do we get a hold of it? There's an element to like the use of blockchain within AI, which is how do you track data in and out, which is sort of interesting. To me, it's more about how do two artificial intelligence systems communicate with each other. So if you have a system and I have a system and they're navigating the world agentically, right? On our behalf, but really they're making their own decisions. How do they communicate with each other in a way that reflects the incentives that we told it to reflect? And I think the only way to do that is really with a crypto or with a blockchain, right? So you have these open communications, open financial systems, and I think they're going to be adopted by agents and artificial intelligent programs, self-driving cars, drones, things like that. And I do think that at some point, like the language of AI is in whole or in part crypto. And one of the things I say in this book is it wouldn't surprise me if at the end of the day, 20, 30, 40 years from now, the story of crypto is a footnote in the story of AI. And it's really interesting to be sort of within the industry and to see the AI space develop and to see that you have a part in it, but that the AI, community and what they're trying to do is much larger than what I think even crypto's grandest ambitions are. And that's really exciting to try to be a part of that story.
And why do you see blockchain being a solution to the problem of these AIs communicating with each other as opposed to them creating their own type of communication system? What is it about the immutable aspect of it or the autonomous nature of it or open source? What is it about it that makes it a good fit?
So, to me, it's not even about the immutability, it's about the openness, right? So you should be able to have different systems. If you have everything talking on the same platform that is walled off, some large company is going to be in control of that. But if you do want a situation where you have different individuals, different companies creating these autonomous agents, and they need to talk to each other in a way that is like completely open and completely fluid. I take the view that the only communication that every artificial intelligent agent can understand is one of economics, right? So it might be that as you and I are both in self-driving cars and we're trying to navigate rights away, well, I have a priority designation on my car and you don't have one on yours. There are going to be these microtransactions. There's going to be some level of communication that has to happen. And I just don't see that going through in the long run, the Visa network or, a closed off system. It has to be somewhat open sourced. So, what's fun about it is that you can't necessarily be wrong at this point because it's so new. So you get to kind of talk a little more freely, whereas you can be wrong on a lot of things in crypto because it's been you know developing for so many years that it's sometimes a little less fun to talk about.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what comes over the next few years, just because I think we're at such a point of exponential growth in AI. Just even seeing how ChatGPT has gone from 2 years ago, I think it was introduced February 2023, if I remember correctly, to the public, and now you can create videos that are a few minutes in length with a click of a couple buttons. It's unbelievable, and it's unrealistic to think AI agents will be welcomed into the Swift network. And if they aren't, there's an alternative that they'll need.
Well, this is something that's like true of all of our financial infrastructure, which is I was thinking about this in terms of like securities infrastructure, right? Who can buy and sell securities? And there's all these custody is very difficult, settlement is very difficult. A broker dealer or an ATS can't right now engage in non-securities, right? And it all works really well. This is the thing, it has developed, it works pretty well. But if you had to create it over today from scratch, you would never create what we currently have. And this is the difficulty with trying to put new technologies into legacy systems, is that the new technologies fundamentally change what we can do, but do we want to dismantle the thing that already works? Right. So in the US, our capital markets, I do believe this, are the envy of the world. We have the most robust capital market infrastructure. It's secure. It is dependable. It's the reason why so much investment goes into the US. We could make it a lot more efficient, but would require us to blow up the system a bit. Do we want to do that? And that's what we're struggling with at every level of the financial regulatory industry. And that's what they're struggling with at the SEC. So if you see a lot of the questions that are coming out of the SEC roundtables, it's basically, how do we fit crypto into this? Mm-hmm. Maybe the answer is that we need to create a new thing, but there's been decades and decades and decades of infrastructure and billions of dollars and brilliant people making this system work so well. And so much of our global economy depends on it. Do we change that in order to make it work better? This is a really difficult question.
And V. Lee had a great point in the podcast that I recorded with her a couple weeks ago, just speaking about how had crypto been around at the time where they were creating these rules, they most likely adopt blockchain technology to solve for all those issues. All the institutions, all the agencies, all the rules, and most of the rules, at least with brokers and dealers, those came out because there was no better technology. Now that the technology exists, we're in an interesting spot where we need to almost go backwards in a sense to adopt that technology that wasn't available at the time.
Here's to me like one of the more difficult questions is, in order to fit crypto into legacy equities trading, you have this gap because you have a delayed settlement time for equities, and you have this intermediated system in which individuals cannot directly interact with securities exchanges, right? They have to go through these broker dealers. So if you're going to integrate Bitcoin transactions or crypto transactions, do you make the securities more like crypto, or do you put all of these restrictions on those crypto transactions? So all of a sudden, even though Bitcoin can settle in 10 minutes, you're requiring it to go through T+1 or T+2 settlement. Even though you can go onto a platform and buy Bitcoin directly from that platform or interact directly with an exchange, do you require folks to still go through a broker dealer if you're doing it through this model? And to me, it's really difficult because you're getting rid of all of the benefits of crypto by trying to put into the system. And I don't know how the market will react. Maybe they'll just say, well, I want to be able to do everything from my like Schwab account or whatever. But you have to kind of build it and then see what the market reacts to. And I think it's challenging and it's expensive.
It is. And I think one thing that makes me optimistic of the future is what we're seeing now with different jurisdictions in terms of how they're approaching blockchain technology, and how in Hong Kong they have the Aspire framework. In the US, they're working towards making it a much more welcoming, trying to make it the crypto capital of the world. We're seeing jurisdictions now competing for the business of crypto. And so with that comes, okay, well, now all you need is one exchange willing to say, we're going to put our securities on a blockchain. And all of a sudden there's 24/7 trading, instant settlement, nearly instant settlement. To me, that's what will lead to the necessity for larger areas like the US to adapt.
And to get back to sort of what has changed in the last year since like the first edition of the book to the 2025 edition. And to me, it's that when I was writing the 2024 edition, there was still a question of, okay, if Biden wins again or Kamala wins, do they just try to kill the industry completely? Right? That was still an option. And what I think has happened since President Trump's got elected is like such a minority of a minority position that I don't think it comes back. So even if there is a pendulum swing in the other way in a few years and there's a Democratic administration, even when that's hostile, I don't think that the hostility results in, let's just say everything is a security and that they're unregulated and that there's not a way forward, right? Let's just try to kill it. And because the US has kind of come off of that position, you're seeing countries all over the world, even ones that were less hostile, become even more like, okay, this is here. How do we get a hold of it? So I do a lot of work, in different jurisdictions. And I'm telling you, the moment that Trump got elected, other countries that you would even view as hostile to Trump started to take the position of like, okay, let's get our stuff together. We need to figure out what we're doing here because this isn't going away in the next 4 years or after. So I think that in general, we're in a much better position now than we were when the first edition came out, where it was like, I don't know if I have a job, in a couple of years if this whole industry collapses under regulatory pressure.
And we've seen a great example of that in Canada as well, where CIRO, one of our principal securities regulatory bodies, one of the more important ones, they're hiring, and I don't know if they've hired yet, but they're hiring a senior crypto advisor. And I've never seen a position like that advertised publicly. And it just goes to show that jurisdictions are paying attention. They say, hey, this is sticking around. This is here to stay. And once you see that posturing, I think it will be difficult to put the cat back in the hat, so to speak. Now, I do worry that if things do swing too out of control, where meme coins and everything can proliferate, and we do see another FTX-like collapse, there is that risk there as well. But for the most part, I am optimistic.
There's that risk. I mean, I think the way to prevent that, to the extent you can, is where there's already regulation at the state level, right? Eventually it's going to be at a federal level, but like fraud has to be investigated at a federal level. At the state level, like they need to continue to observe and to regulate their money transmitters. But again, this goes back to, we need to incentivize good folks getting into this space. And that means that there has to be an avenue to create projects that have a token somewhere involved that aren't NFTs and that aren't meme coins. And once they solve that problem, I do think that there's going to be a lot of benefit to not only the crypto space, but the broader technology industry, because you're going to start to see projects infiltrate other areas outside of like pure crypto plays.
I think so as well. And I think it will be interesting to see what happens, because often people who have been in the industry for quite a few years now, not only are you worn from the years of being in crypto, it ages you for sure, but
Yeah.
also you forget and you lose the perspective how early we really are. We don't really even have rules and regulations from major governments about this. So I'm really optimistic for what we see in the future. And I think the book is a great spot for anyone to start, whether you're a law student, you're a lawyer in the US, or a lawyer not practicing in the United States. It's something I recommend for lawyers, where you need to know what's happening there and at least have an idea of which questions to ask. It's such a good resource to get that LLM type level education without having to go to courses. It's a lot cheaper too. Is it $30, I think, still?
Yeah, $30. I mean, the reason for that is because the first edition came out in April 2024, and if you read it today, it gives you an entirely different picture of what the state of the law is. I mean, especially when you have a presidential election, right? That was as impactful as this last one. The law changes so quickly that I would feel bad, one, charging like $200 for a textbook, and then two, it becomes completely useless after about a year. So with this, it's like, okay, it's $30. As things get a little more out of date, right, you're not feeling bad that you went into like student loan debt to take it out, because these are on the syllabuses for a lot of schools. So I didn't want to charge students too much for it. And then it's also easier for me to update these. So in the last edition, I don't know, you probably bought yours like fairly early, but throughout the year, when something would happen that was impactful, I would write a little note and I would update the edition. So anyone who bought it from that point on would get like at least a little mini version of that update. I'm going to do the same thing here. So if we have, market structure bill gets passed, or the Genius Act, right, passes, I'll just update the book, and whoever purchases from that point on will still have it pretty up to date.
I'm looking forward to getting my copy of the second edition, Justin. Thank you so much for joining me. Is there anything else you'd like to add for people who might be interested in the book?
You can get the book through Amazon or on digital copy. If you go to thecryptolegalhandbook.com, it's available. One thing that I did in this book is I really tried to make it user friendly. So there's 375 footnotes and, I don't know, 50 other supplemental resources. And if you go to the cryptolegalhandbook.com/resources, all of them are available for free. Like, go through and see, like, what am I citing? And if you honestly, if you're starting from even zero and you read through the book and you go through these sources, like, you're going to have a deep expertise, because I think everything that you could possibly want to know about crypto and the law, at least from like just getting involved, it's in there and it's accessible, and I tried to write it in a way that wasn't too academic. But Jacob, I appreciate you having me on. Maybe next year when I'm on for the 2026 edition, we'll both be AI versions of ourselves, and we'll just be having coffee while our agents have a conversation about the book with each other.
Hey, if that means you're in Toronto or I'm in California, I'll be happy about that. All right. Thanks everyone for listening. That's another episode of the Law of Code podcast in the bank. If you're interested in learning more about our sponsor, Day One Law, you can find a link in the show notes below. We'll see you next time.